the text arrived from a number that didn't exist. I was in my workshop behind the cabin when my phone buzzed, and I almost didn't check it because I was in the middle of explaining to a group of weekend warriors why their expensive REI fire starter was basically just overpriced magnesium, and how a dollar store ferro rod would do the same job if they actually knew what they were doing. The notification lit up my screen and I glanced down out of habit, expecting another spam message about extending my car warranty or whatever bullshit was trending that week. But instead I saw 3 words that made my stomach drop in a way I hadn't felt since my last deployment in Afghanistan. Leave the cities, that's it. Just those 3 words from a number that showed up as all zeros. Which isn't possible in the North American phone system because every legitimate number has to follow specific formatting rules, and I'd spent enough time in military intelligence to know that when someone goes through the trouble of masking their identity that thoroughly, they're either incredibly paranoid or they know something the rest of us don't. I stared at the screen for maybe 10 seconds while my students waited for me to continue my demonstration. And I felt this cold certainty settling into my chest like someone had just confirmed something I'd been dreading for years but hoping would never actually happen. "Blake, you good, man?" That was David, one of my regulars who came to these wilderness survival courses every fall, because he had some fantasy about being the guy who saves his family when society collapses. And though if I'm being honest, he could barely start a fire without matches and would probably be one of the first casualties in any real emergency. He was looking at me with that concerned expression people get when they think you might be having a stroke, which I probably deserved because I'd completely frozen mid-sentence about oxidation rates in magnesium combustion. I shoved the phone back in my pocket and forced myself to smile in that way I'd perfected over 12 years of teaching people skills they'd probably never use. "Yeah, sorry, just remembered I forgot to call someone back," I lied. Because the truth that I'd just received an anonymous warning that civilization was about to collapse wasn't exactly appropriate conversation for a Sunday afternoon survival class in the Olympic National Forest. Anyway, as I was saying, the real trick with ferro rods is the angle of your strike and the dryness of your tinder, not how much money you spent on the damn thing. I went through the motions for the rest of the class, showing them how to build a proper debris shelter, how to identify edible plants versus the ones that would make them wish they were dead, how to purify water without fancy filters, but my mind was somewhere else entirely, turning over that text message like a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. Someone had gone to significant effort to warn me specifically, which meant either they knew me personally, or they'd identified me as someone worth saving, and neither option was particularly comforting when I thought about the implications. I'd kept my military service quiet after I'd gotten out. You had deliberately chosen this isolated existence in the Pacific Northwest specifically because I'd seen enough of what humans did to each other when resources got scarce, and I wanted no part of whatever fresh hell was brewing in the cities. By the time I'd finished the class and sent my students on their way with their shiny new knowledge that most of them would forget by next weekend, the sun was starting to dip behind the massive Douglas firs that surrounded my property, and I was pulling up news websites on my phone trying to figure out what the hell had prompted that warning. At first, everything looked normal. Politicians arguing about meaningless shit, sports scores, celebrity gossip. But then I found it buried in the middle of a regional news site that most people probably never even looked at. Unusual flu activity reported in Seattle hospitals. CDC monitoring situation. The article was maybe 3 paragraphs long and used that carefully neutral language that news outlets employ when they want to report something concerning without causing panic, describing how several Seattle area hospitals had seen an uptick in severe flu cases over the past 48 hours. Patients presenting with aggressive symptoms and unusual behavioral changes that didn't match typical influenza patterns. The CDC had apparently sent a team to investigate, which on its own wasn't particularly alarming because the CDC investigates weird disease clusters all the time and 99% of them turn out to be nothing. But combined with that anonymous text, it felt like a confirmation of something I didn't want to believe. And I sat on my porch watching the forest darken while my mind ran through scenarios, most of them bad. And I realized I was doing that thing I'd done 1,000 times during my ranger days, the mental math of threat assessment, calculating odds and options and worst-case outcomes. If this was a legitimate pandemic brewing, the cities would be death traps within days once people started panicking, and Seattle was only about 2 hours from my cabin depending on traffic, which meant I had maybe 72 hours before whatever was happening there started spilling out into the surrounding areas. If I was wrong, if this turned out to be nothing, then I'd have wasted some time and effort preparing for a crisis that never materialized. But if I was right and I didn't prepare, I'd be dead or worse within a week. The decision made itself really, because in situations like this, the downside of being wrong about danger is so much worse than the downside of being wrong about safety. And I'd rather be the paranoid asshole who overreacted than the dead idiot who didn't react at all. I went inside and started pulling gear, moving with the kind of methodical efficiency that comes from years of training and deployment, grabbing my bug-out bag from the closet and checking its contents even though I already knew what was in there because I'd packed it myself 3 years ago and updated it every 6 months like clockwork. 30 days of freeze-dried food, water purification tablets, basic medical supplies, cold weather gear, a hunting knife that had cost more than most people's car payments, 50 feet of paracord fire-starting equipment that would work in any conditions, and 100 other small items that could mean the difference between survival and death in the wilderness. The rifle came next. A .308 Winchester that I'd customized specifically for long-range accuracy and reliability, along with 60 rounds of ammunition that I kept stored separately from the weapon because I wasn't an idiot and unsecured firearms were a good way to end up dead if someone broke into your cabin while you were gone. I'd spent enough time in combat zones to have complicated feelings about guns, but I'd also spent enough time in the real world to know that being philosophically opposed to violence was a luxury you could only afford when someone else was willing to do violence on your behalf. And out here in the wilderness, there was nobody else to call when things went bad. My phone buzzed again, and for a second I thought it might be another message from my anonymous friend. But instead it was just a news alert from one of the apps I'd installed, and when I opened it, the headline made my blood run cold in a way that confirmed every paranoid instinct I'd been trying to ignore. Seattle Hospital declares emergency situation, reports of violent patients, police responding to multiple incidents. That was it. That was the tipping point between concerning situation and get the fuck out now. And I didn't waste any more time second-guessing myself because I'd learned a long time ago that the people who survive emergencies are the ones who act decisively when everyone else is still trying to convince themselves things will be fine. I grabbed my truck keys and started loading gear, moving everything from my bug-out bag plus additional supplies I kept cached for exactly this kind of situation. And within 20 minutes I was pulling out of my driveway, heading deeper into the Olympic National Forest toward a place I'd found 2 years ago but never told anyone about because some secrets are worth keeping. The drive took me northwest on increasingly rough Forest Service roads that most people didn't even know existed, past the tourist areas where hikers took their Instagram photos and felt like they'd experienced the wilderness, into the real backcountry where cell service disappeared and help was measured in days rather than hours. I'd been exploring these woods for over a decade, first as a hobby to decompress from civilian life after the Army, then as part of my job teaching survival skills, and I'd developed the kind of intimate knowledge of the terrain that only comes from thousands of hours of careful observation and note-taking. About 3 years ago, I'd stumbled onto a section of old-growth forest that somehow the logging companies had missed, probably because it was so remote and the terrain so difficult that it wasn't worth the effort to extract the timber. And in the middle of that ancient grove, I'd found something that had taken my breath away. The tree was an absolute monster of a western red cedar, easily 12 feet in diameter at the base and probably 800 years old if I had to guess. The kind of thing that would have been sacred to the indigenous peoples who'd lived here before Europeans showed up and decided everything needed to be either monetized or destroyed. And what made it special, though, wasn't just its size, but what had happened to it sometime in the distant past. A fire had hollowed out the interior of the trunk, creating a natural cavity that extended upward for maybe 40 feet, with the tree somehow continuing to live and grow around the damaged section. The entrance was a narrow gap at ground level that you'd never notice unless you were looking for it, hidden behind a massive root system and heavy undergrowth. And the interior was like stepping into a natural bunker with walls of ancient wood and enough space for a person to live relatively comfortably if they were willing to do some modification work. I'd visited the hollow tree maybe a dozen times since discovering it, never staying long. Just making mental notes about its potential as an emergency shelter and occasionally leaving small caches of supplies that I'd hidden in waterproof containers and buried under layers of duff and moss where no one would ever find them unless they knew exactly where to look. Now, as I hiked through the darkening forest with my gear weighing heavy on my back, I felt this strange mixture of vindication and dread, because apparently all that paranoid preparation was about to pay off, but only because something catastrophic was happening in the world I'd left behind. The forest was quiet in that particular way it gets just after sunset, when the daytime animals have bedded down and the nocturnal ones haven't quite emerged yet, and the only sounds were my boots crunching through the undergrowth and my own breathing as I navigated by headlamp through terrain that would be nearly impossible to traverse if you didn't know the route. After maybe 2 hours of hiking, I reached the grove, and there it was exactly as I'd left it, the massive cedar rising into the darkness like some kind of monument to a time when the world was wilder and stranger than anything we'd managed to build in its place. I approached the entrance carefully because you never knew what might have taken up residence in a nice dry cavity like this. Bears, cougars, even just raccoons or possums could be a problem if they'd decided to make it home. But when I shone my headlamp through the gap, I didn't see any signs of recent animal activity, no scat or food remains or disturbed bedding material. What I did see, coiled in the upper reaches of the hollow about 20 feet above the floor, were 2 eyes reflecting my light with that particular greenish shine that made my hand instinctively move toward the knife on my belt. The snake was massive, easily 6 feet long and thick-bodied in the way that meant it was well-fed and healthy, with the distinctive pattern and rattle that identified it as a timber rattlesnake, which shouldn't even have been this far west since their range was supposed to be mostly east of the Cascades. But apparently no one had informed this particular specimen about proper geographic distribution, and we stared at each other for maybe 30 seconds while I did the mental calculus of whether trying to kill it was worth the risk of getting bitten in an enclosed space when the nearest hospital was probably already overrun with whatever the hell was happening in Seattle. And the snake did its own calculation about whether I was a threat worth striking at or just another annoyance to be tolerated. Well, shit, I said out loud, because talking to myself had become a habit during my years of living alone, and I saw no reason to stop just because there was a giant venomous snake watching me like I was the intruder in its home. This is gonna be a problem, isn't it? The snake didn't respond, which was probably for the best because if it had started talking back, I would have known I'd already lost my mind and saved everyone a lot of trouble. Instead, it just stayed coiled in its elevated position while I stood at the entrance trying to decide my next move. And eventually I settled on the only logical course of action. I'd deal with the snake later after I'd secured the shelter and established that I could actually survive here. because getting into a fight with a rattlesnake when I was exhausted from hiking and stressed about the potential end of civilization seemed like a great way to die from something completely preventable. I set up my initial camp in the lower section of the hollow, as far from the snake as I could manage, and started unpacking the gear I'd brought with me while occasionally glancing up to make sure my new roommate wasn't descending to object to my presence. The hollow was bigger than I'd remembered, and with enough space that if I was careful about organization, I could probably store a month's worth of supplies and still have room to sleep and move around, though I'd need to do some work on the entrance to make it more secure and less obvious from the outside. The last thing I wanted was some desperate refugee from Seattle stumbling onto my shelter and deciding they needed it more than I did, because I'd seen enough of human nature under stress to know that civilized behavior was only about 3 missed meals away from complete collapse. My portable radio picked up exactly 2 stations that night, both of them broadcasting emergency alerts in that carefully controlled voice that news anchors use when they want to inform you that something terrible is happening without actually saying the words that would cause mass panic. Apparently, the flu outbreak in Seattle had spread to multiple hospitals and was now being characterized as a major public health emergency, with the National Guard being deployed to help with population management and quarantine enforcement, which was bureaucratic speak for, "We're locking down the city and shooting anyone who tries to leave without permission." The second station was playing automated emergency broadcast system messages telling people to stay in their homes and await further instructions, which was exactly the kind of advice that would get you killed in a real crisis, because staying put when you should be moving was how you ended up trapped with no options and no hope. I turned off the radio and sat in the darkness listening to the forest, and that's when I heard it, distant screaming, coming from somewhere to the east, maybe 5 or 6 miles away if I had to guess. It went on for maybe 2 minutes, this raw sound of terror and pain that carried through the quiet night air with perfect clarity. And then it stopped abruptly in a way that probably meant whoever was making that noise wasn't going to be making any more noise ever again. The snake shifted position above me, and I could hear its scales sliding against the wood, and I realized that maybe having a venomous predator sharing my shelter wasn't actually the worst thing that could happen, because at least snakes were predictable in their way, operating on simple survival logic that didn't include the kind of creative cruelty that humans were capable of when social structures broke down. I slept that night with my rifle across my chest and my knife within arm's reach. And every time I woke up, which was about every hour because my nervous system wasn't letting me fully rest, I could see those 2 reflective eyes watching me from above. And I found myself wondering if the snake was thinking the same thing I was, which was basically, "I don't trust you, but I'm too tired to do anything about you right now, so let's just coexist for the moment and figure out the details later." Morning came gray and cold, with fog rolling through the forest in a way that reduced visibility to maybe 10 feet, which was unusual for September in this area but not unheard of. And I spent the first hour just sitting in the entrance of the hollow, watching and listening for any signs of movement or threat. The world felt different somehow. Like something fundamental had shifted during the night. And when I finally picked up enough courage to turn on the radio again, the news confirmed that my instincts were right. Seattle was gone, or at least the Seattle we knew was gone, replaced by something that the breathless reporters were calling unprecedented civil unrest and mass casualty situation, without ever quite explaining what was causing people to tear each other apart in the streets. I needed to scout the area, needed to understand what I was dealing with and how far the crisis had spread, so I cached most of my heavy gear inside the hollow and headed out with just my rifle and a small pack, moving through the fog with the kind of caution that becomes second nature when you've spent time in hostile territory. About 2 miles from the hollow, I found an abandoned campsite, one of those family recreation setups with a big tent and folding chairs and a Coleman stove. Except now the tent was torn open from the inside and there was blood everywhere, dark and dried and splattered across the camping equipment in patterns that suggested violence rather than accident. No bodies, though, which was somehow worse than finding bodies because it meant whatever had happened here had ended with people being dragged off rather than killed on sight. I was examining the torn tent fabric, trying to figure out what kind of weapon or tool could have made those particular shredding marks, when I heard movement in the fog behind me and spun around with my rifle raised just in time to see a woman stumbling out of the tree line about 30 yards away. She was maybe 50 years old. I dressed in hiking clothes that were torn and stained, and there was something fundamentally wrong about the way she was moving. This jerky, uncoordinated gait that reminded me of how people move when they're drunk, except faster and more aggressive. Her skin had this grayish pallor that shouldn't be possible on a living person, and when she noticed me and locked eyes, I saw that her pupils were clouded over with a milky film that made her look more like a corpse than a human being. "Ma'am," I called out because some part of my brain was still trying to process this as a medical emergency rather than a threat, still hoping this was just someone who was sick and needed help rather than something that wanted to kill me. "Are you okay? Do you need—" she charged. I'd like to say I made a calm, rational decision in that moment. I weighed the moral implications and considered all my options before acting. But the truth is, my training kicked in faster than my conscious thoughts, and I put 2 rounds through her chest center mass before I even finished processing what was happening. She went down hard, hitting the ground in a way that should have knocked the wind out of her and ended the fight, except she didn't stay down. Instead, she started trying to get back up, clawing at the dirt and making these wet, rasping sounds that definitely weren't coming from someone who was just sick with the flu. I adjusted my aim and put a 3rd round through her head, and that finally stopped the movement, leaving me standing in the fog with my ears ringing from the gunshots and my hands shaking from adrenaline while I tried to understand what the hell had just happened. I approached the body carefully, keeping my rifle trained on it in case Hollywood had lied to me about how many bullets it took to stop someone, and when I got close enough to really examine her, I saw the bite marks on her neck, deep and ragged and infected looking, with the surrounding tissue already starting to show signs of necrosis. Her skin was fever-hot to the touch despite the cool morning air, and when I checked for a pulse, I didn't find one even though she'd been moving just seconds ago, which violated pretty much everything I knew about human biology and suggested that whatever this disease was, it didn't follow normal pathological rules. I spent maybe 5 minutes examining the scene, taking mental notes about symptoms and behavior patterns and transmission vectors. And then I got the hell out of there before whatever had drawn this woman to this location decided to send more of her friends. The hike back to the hollow felt longer than it should have, probably because I was jumping at every sound and shadow. My nervous system flooded with the kind of hypervigilance that comes from confirming that yes, the world has actually ended, and yes, you are now living in a horror movie whether you like it or not. When I got back to the tree, I found that the snake had moved my food cache. Not eaten it, not destroyed it, just moved it. The waterproof container I'd hidden in the upper reaches of the hollow was now sitting about 6 feet from where I'd left it, positioned in a way that suggested deliberate placement rather than random disturbance. Even the snake was coiled nearby, watching me with what I could have sworn was a calculating expression, though attributing human-level intelligence to a reptile was probably just my stressed brain looking for patterns where none existed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the snake had decided to make some kind of territorial claim and was now waiting to see how I'd respond. I pulled out a strip of the venison jerky I'd packed, cut it into smaller pieces with my knife, and tossed them up toward the snake's position, figuring that if we were going to be roommates, we might as well establish some kind of relationship that didn't involve one of us killing the other. The snake watched the meat land near it, tongued the air for a few seconds, and then slowly uncoiled and consumed the jerky with the kind of methodical efficiency that suggested this wasn't its first time accepting food from a human. Which was weird because timber rattlesnakes aren't exactly known for being social animals that interact positively with people. "All right," I said, sitting down and pulling out my own food because apparently I was having a conversation with a snake now, and my life had officially become stranger than any deployment I'd ever been on. "Here's the deal, I need this shelter, you apparently also need this shelter, and there's some seriously bad shit happening out there that makes both of us safer if we're not fighting each other. So how about we declare a truce? You stay in your section, I stay in mine. And we both pretend we're okay with this arrangement until one of us figures out something better." The snake didn't answer, but it also didn't try to bite me, which I took as a tentative yes to my proposed arrangement. I spent the rest of that day fortifying the hollow, camouflaging the entrance with additional branches and undergrowth so it would be nearly impossible to spot unless you were specifically looking for it, setting up my sleeping area in a way that maximized defensive options if someone or something managed to get inside, and generally doing all the paranoid preparation work that 12 years of military training and 2 years of survival instruction had taught me to do when establishing a defensible position. The radio had more bad news that evening, and though at this point, news was a generous term for what was mostly just automated emergency messages and the occasional panicked broadcast from amateur radio operators who were sharing information about the spread of whatever this plague was. Seattle was lost, that much was clear, and the infection was spreading east and south faster than any containment measures could stop it, with reports coming in from Tacoma and Olympia and even smaller towns that suggested the entire Puget Sound region was going to be overrun within 72 hours. And the government was talking about quarantine zones and strategic withdrawal, which was military speak for, "We're abandoning these areas to their fate." And I realized that my anonymous texter had done me a massive favor by warning me early enough to get out before the roads became impassable and the cities became mass graves. I tried to sleep that night but kept waking up to sounds. Distant gunfire, more screaming, once what sounded like a helicopter passing overhead, though it could have just been thunder or my imagination. Each time I woke up, I could see the snake watching me from its elevated position, those reflective eyes constant and unwavering, and I started thinking of it less as a threat and more as, I don't know, a companion maybe. That's probably too strong a word for a relationship based on mutual non-aggression, rather than actual affection. But there was something weirdly comforting about having another living thing sharing the space. Even if that living thing was a 6-foot rattlesnake with enough venom to kill me 3 times over if it decided I was a problem. The third morning I woke to find a dead rat at the base of my sleeping bag. Not near my food supplies where you'd expect a rat to be, but deliberately placed right next to where I'd been sleeping. And when I looked up, the snake was in its usual spot watching me with what I was increasingly convinced was intelligent awareness rather than simple reptilian instinct. The rat had been killed cleanly, single strike to the neck. It and the snake hadn't eaten it, even though that would have been the normal behavior for a predator that had just made a kill. Instead, it had brought the rat to me, or more accurately brought the rat to my sleeping area where it would be protecting my food from being contaminated or stolen by vermin, which suggested a level of cooperative behavior that I'd never heard of in wild snakes. "Did you—" I started, then stopped because I was talking to a snake again, and that felt like maybe I was losing my grip on sanity faster than I'd thought. "Did you kill that to protect my supplies? Or are you just showing off?" The snake predictably didn't answer, but something in the way it moved, settling back into its coil with what I could have sworn was a satisfied posture, made me think that maybe we'd just evolved from cautious coexistence into something approaching actual cooperation. which was going to make the next few weeks or months significantly less lonely, even if my main companion was a cold-blooded reptile that could kill me with a single bite. I spent that day scouting further from the hollow, moving in expanding circles to map the area and identify potential resources and threats, and what I found wasn't encouraging. There were bodies in the forest now, hikers and campers who'd been caught by whatever this infection was, and they'd all been killed in the same way. Massive trauma, signs of being attacked by other humans rather than animals, and the kind of violence that spoke to complete breakdown of higher reasoning and social inhibition. Some of them had started to move again after death, this shambling reanimated state that violated every law of biology I'd ever learned. And I made note to avoid them entirely because testing whether they were actually dangerous seemed like the kind of scientific curiosity that could get you killed when there were no hospitals or antibiotics to save you from your own stupid decisions. The fog was getting thicker too, which was weird because September shouldn't have this kind of persistent marine layer this far inland, and when I paid attention I noticed that it had a slightly acrid smell to it, like chemicals or industrial pollutants, though there weren't any factories or refineries within 50 miles that could be producing that kind of atmospheric contamination. I made a mental note to avoid prolonged exposure when possible, because if the plague wasn't enough to kill you, maybe environmental hazards would finish the job, and headed back to the hollow before the light failed completely. That night I sat in the darkness listening to the world fall apart through my radio, and the snake descended from its elevated position for the first time since I'd arrived, coiling itself into a loose spiral about 3 feet from where I sat. I didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon, just sat very still and let it make whatever decision it was going to make. And after maybe 5 minutes of this standoff, it moved closer and settled into what I recognized from my survival training as a thermoregulation position. It was sharing body heat with me, using my warmth to maintain its metabolic temperature during the cool night, which was smart behavior for a cold-blooded animal, but also suggested a level of trust that I wouldn't attack it while it was vulnerable. "All right then," I said quietly, because if a snake was willing to trust me enough to use me as a heat source, I figured the least I could do was acknowledge the arrangement. "I guess we're doing this. You and me against whatever the hell is happening out there. Fair warning, though. I'm probably going to give you a name at some point because I can't keep calling you the snake in my head. And you don't get to complain about it because you're a snake, and snakes don't complain about anything as far as I know." The snake, showing remarkable restraint, didn't complain. I named it Guardian 3 days later after it saved my life for the first time. I'd been out scavenging at an abandoned ranger station about 3 miles from the hollow, loading up on canned food and emergency supplies that the Forest Service had stockpiled for exactly this kind of crisis, even though they probably hadn't imagined the crisis would involve reanimated corpses eating people. When I heard movement behind one of the storage shelves, my first instinct was to raise my rifle, but before I could complete the motion, Guardian, who'd apparently followed me from the hollow, though I hadn't noticed it trailing behind me, let out this sharp hissing sound that I'd learned meant, "Danger close, pay attention, you idiot." I spun around and there were 3 of them, infected humans moving with that characteristic jerky speed, and they'd somehow gotten between me and the exit without making enough noise to alert me, because apparently whatever this disease did to people, it also made them better at stealth hunting than they'd been in life. Guardian struck the nearest one, fangs sinking deep into its calf muscle. And while the bite probably wouldn't do much to something that was already dead, it created enough distraction for me to put rounds through all 3 of them before they could close the distance and do whatever horrible things infected did to uninfected when they caught them. After that, I stopped thinking of the snake as it and started thinking of Guardian as, I don't know, a partner maybe? It sounds insane saying it out loud, developing an emotional attachment to a venomous reptile in the middle of the apocalypse. But loneliness does strange things to the human brain, and having any kind of companionship, even from something that could kill me, was better than facing this nightmare completely alone. Guardian seemed to pick up on the shift in our relationship too, and because after that incident it started staying closer when I went out scavenging, positioning itself where it could watch my back, occasionally hissing warnings when it detected threats before I did. 2 weeks into living in the hollow, I'd accumulated about 90 days' worth of food, 60 rounds of ammunition, a complete medical kit scavenged from 3 different ranger stations, and enough miscellaneous supplies that I felt reasonably confident I could survive out here for months if necessary, possibly longer if I was careful about rationing and supplemented stored food with hunting and foraging. Guardian had established itself as an efficient hunter in its own right, by killing rats and mice that tried to get into my supplies and occasionally bringing down rabbits that it didn't eat, but left near my sleeping area in what I'd started to interpret as food-sharing behavior, which was so far outside normal snake behavior that I'd given up trying to understand it, and just accepted that the apocalypse had apparently made everything weird, including interspecies cooperation. The fog was getting worse, though, and that was becoming a serious problem. I first noticed it on day 12 when I left a metal canteen outside the hollow while I was working on some modifications to the entrance, and when I came back 2 hours later, the surface of the canteen showed visible pitting and corrosion, like someone had splashed acid on it even though nothing had touched it except the fog. And I ran some tests with different materials, leather, fabric, various types of metal, and discovered that prolonged exposure to the fog caused degradation across the board, with organic materials breaking down faster than inorganic ones, and all of it happening at a rate that shouldn't be possible from normal atmospheric moisture. The implications were terrifying because if the fog was corrosive, then I needed protective equipment every time I went outside for extended periods, and if I didn't have adequate protection, then I was going to develop chemical burns or respiratory damage or whatever other horrible side effects came from breathing in whatever toxic soup this fog was made of. I improvised protective gear from my rain suit and duct tape. You're sealing all the seams and adding goggles and a respirator I'd scavenged from one of the ranger stations, and it worked well enough that I could spend maybe 4 hours in heavy fog exposure before the equipment started breaking down, and I needed to retreat to safety. The infected seemed completely unaffected by the fog, which made sense in a horrible way because if they were already dead, then chemical burns probably weren't much of a concern, but what was worse was that the fog seemed to enhance them somehow. They moved faster, responded to stimuli more quickly, had better hearing and smell than they'd shown in the early days of the outbreak. I watched from an elevated position as a pack of maybe 8 infected tracked a deer through the forest with coordination that suggested they were communicating somehow, working together to herd the animal toward an ambush point. And when they brought it down, it was brutal and efficient in a way that made my skin crawl because these things weren't mindless zombies anymore. They were evolving into something worse. Guardian proved immune to the fog, which I discovered when it descended from the hollow during one of the heavy fog events, and I watched in horror as it slithered into the gray murk without showing any signs of distress or damage. Its scales seemed to repel whatever corrosive properties the fog contained, and when it returned several hours later, there was no pitting or deterioration that I could detect, which meant Guardian could move through the fog safely while I was trapped waiting for the atmosphere to clear. This turned out to be a massive advantage, because Guardian started doing reconnaissance for me. And I know how insane that sounds because I'm basically claiming a snake was conducting tactical surveillance, but I swear I could give it direction about where to scout, and it would go check and then come back and position itself in ways that communicated information about threats or opportunities. Like I said, insane, but also happening. The bite happened on day 18, and it was entirely my fault. I was cleaning Guardian's scales, removing fog residue that had accumulated during one of its scouting missions, and I got careless about where I was putting my hands while working on the section near its head. Guardian struck purely out of reflex, fangs punching through the flesh of my forearm before I could pull back. And I felt the venom inject with this cold, burning sensation that immediately made my hindbrain scream about impending death because timber rattlesnake venom is hemotoxic and destroys blood cells and tissue in ways that are excruciatingly painful and frequently fatal if you don't get treatment fast. I had anti-venom in my medical kit, the expired kind that might work or might not depending on storage conditions, and I applied a tourniquet and prepared to inject myself while my arm swelled and turned purple and pain radiated up toward my shoulder in waves that made it hard to think straight. Guardian hadn't moved from its position, was just watching me with what I might have imagined was concern if I wasn't hallucinating from venom-induced fever, and I remember thinking, well, this is a stupid way to die. I killed by my own goddamn snake because I wasn't paying attention. The fever hit hard around hour 3, sending me into delirium where I couldn't tell what was real and what was my brain misfiring. And I have vague memories of seeing Guardian coiled around my shoulders, its weight somehow comforting, even though rationally I knew it could kill me again if it wanted to. When I finally came back to consciousness, it was 18 hours later and I was still alive, which was surprising given that untreated timber rattlesnake bites have a mortality rate of somewhere around 10 to 30% depending on venom load and individual physiology. My arm was massively swollen and had this spectacular purple-black coloration that looked like someone had beaten me with a pipe. But when I checked my vital signs, everything seemed stable. And the pain had faded to a dull throb rather than the screaming agony I'd experienced initially. Guardian was still there, coiled nearby, but not on me anymore, and when our eyes met, I swear I saw something in that alien gaze that looked almost like relief, though that might have just been my still-recovering brain projecting human emotions onto a reptile that probably didn't give a shit whether I lived or died beyond the fact that I was a useful source of warmth and security. I spent the next 2 days recovering in the hollow, too weak to go scavenging and basically living off my stored supplies while my body processed the venom and repaired the damage. During one of my brief excursions outside to collect water, I noticed something strange. The fog touched my exposed skin where I'd gotten careless with my protective gear, but instead of the chemical burn I'd experienced before, there was nothing. No irritation, no redness, no tissue damage at all, despite the fact that I'd been in direct contact with the corrosive mist for nearly a minute. I ran tests, deliberately exposing different parts of my body to the fog in controlled intervals, and discovered that apparently Guardian's venom had triggered some kind of adaptive immune response in my system, giving me resistance to whatever chemical cocktail was making the fog toxic. It shouldn't have been possible, violated pretty much everything I knew about pharmacology and immunology, but then again, everything about the current situation violated normal reality, so maybe I should just accept that the apocalypse had its own rules and stop trying to understand them through pre-outbreak scientific frameworks. And the practical impact was enormous, though, because suddenly I could move through the fog during the day without protective equipment, could scavenge in areas where the mist was thick enough that infected struggled to navigate, could avoid detection by staying in fog banks that normal humans would flee from. Guardian had made me immune to one of the primary environmental hazards, had turned a disability into an advantage, and all it had cost me was 18 hours of fever dreams and an arm that looked like someone had used it for target practice. "You saved me," I told Guardian that evening while hand-feeding it strips of fresh rabbit meat I'd hunted during a fog-light morning. "Again. I don't know if you meant to or if it's just coincidence, but either way you saved me and I owe you for that." Guardian accepted the meat with the same methodical efficiency it brought to everything, and then it did something I'd never seen it do before. It moved closer and rested its head against my hand. Just this brief moment of contact that felt almost like affection, before pulling back to its normal position. I sat there for a long time after that, just thinking about how my life had gotten so strange that the most meaningful relationship I had was with a 6-foot rattlesnake that apparently had the intelligence of a border collie and the emotional capacity to form interspecies bonds. The weeks blurred together after that, settling into a rhythm of survival that felt almost normal once I adjusted to the new reality. Morning scavenging runs when the fog was lighter, to afternoon shelter maintenance and equipment repair. Evening planning sessions where I'd mark locations on my map and strategize about resource management and threat assessment. Guardian hunted at night mostly, bringing back kills that we'd share or using its presence to drive small game toward areas where I could harvest them more easily. And I stopped questioning whether a snake could really be that intelligent or cooperative because the evidence was overwhelming and arguing with reality seemed like a waste of energy I needed for staying alive. By week 6, I'd established myself as the master of this particular section of forest, knew every trail and water source within 5 miles, had cached supplies in multiple locations. So losing the hollow wouldn't mean losing everything. Leighton had developed techniques for navigating the fog that made me effectively invisible to both infected and any surviving humans who might be desperate enough to try stealing my resources. Guardian and I worked as a team now. This weird partnership that would have seemed impossible a month ago but now felt as natural as breathing. And for the first time since receiving that anonymous text, I actually felt like maybe I could survive this apocalypse long term if I stayed careful and didn't get overconfident about my advantages. That confidence lasted exactly 3 days before I heard voices in the fog and everything got complicated again. I'd been on a scavenging run about 2 miles from the hollow, checking a campground I'd marked on my mental map as potentially containing useful supplies when I heard them. Human voices. Multiple speakers coming from somewhere to the north of my position. My first instinct was to avoid contact entirely because in my experience other survivors meant competition for resources at best and active threats at worst. But something made me creep closer instead, moving through the fog with the silence I'd learned from my ranger training, until I could observe without being observed. There were 8 of them huddled in a clearing that offered almost no protection from the elements and even less from infected 2 adult men and 4 adult women plus 2 kids who looked maybe 9 and 13. They were in bad shape, inadequate gear, low supplies, no apparent understanding of how the fog worked or what it would do to them with prolonged exposure. The man who seemed to be their leader was maybe 40. He built like someone who'd done manual labor their whole life, and he was barking orders at the others in a way that suggested he'd decided being loud and aggressive was an appropriate leadership style for the apocalypse. "We need to find better shelter before nightfall," he was saying, voice carrying through the fog with painful clarity. "Julie, how much food do we have left?" A woman who looked like she was in her 30s checked through their supplies and shook her head. "Maybe enough for 2 days if we ration. Less if we feed everyone properly." "Then we ration," the man said with the kind of casual cruelty that suggested he hadn't fully thought through what rationing meant when 2 of your group members were children. "Kids eat half portions, adults eat quarter portions, and we make it stretch to 5 days and hope we find more supplies before then." Guardian hissed softly from where it had positioned itself near my shoulder, and I reached up to touch its scales in what had become our signal for, "I hear you, but we're staying quiet for now." I watched the group for another 20 minutes, observing their dynamics and assessing their situation, and what I saw wasn't encouraging. They were desperate, poorly led, and had maybe 48 hours before the fog exposure started causing serious health problems that would kill them just as surely as infected or starvation. I could help them. I had supplies, knowledge, immunity to the fog that could benefit all of them if I was willing to share it. But helping them meant risk that they'd try to take my resources by force, a risk that they'd follow me back to the hollow and compromise my security. Risk that I'd save them today only to watch them die tomorrow because they fundamentally lacked the skills to survive in this new world. Derek, that seemed to be the leader's name based on how the others addressed him, had the kind of aggressive energy that made me think he'd be perfectly happy using violence to solve problems if he thought he could get away with it. And the way the others deferred to him suggested either respect or fear, though I suspected it was more the latter than the former. I made my decision and crept away before anyone noticed my presence, heading back to the hollow with Guardian following close behind. They weren't my problem. I couldn't save everyone. Couldn't. He couldn't risk my own survival for people who'd probably just drag me down with their incompetence and poor planning. I'd done my part by warning anyone who'd listened during my years of teaching wilderness survival. Had tried to prepare people for exactly this kind of scenario, and if they hadn't listened, then that was on them, not me. That night I listened to screaming from the direction where I'd seen the group camped, and I knew infected had found them because that's what always happened when people made too much noise or stayed in exposed positions for too long. The screaming went on for maybe 5 minutes, punctuated by gunshots that meant someone in the group had weapons and ammunition, and then it cut off abruptly in that way that meant either everyone was dead or everyone had fled into the fog where they'd die slightly slower from exposure and chemical burns. Guardian coiled closer to me that night, and I found myself talking to it more than usual, trying to justify my decision not to help. They would have gotten us killed, I said to those unwavering, reflective eyes. Derek would have taken our supplies, maybe killed us for them, and even if he didn't, they'd have led infected back to the hollow or attracted other desperate survivors who'd want what we have. I made the right call, the hard call, but the right one. Guardian didn't judge me, which was good because I was doing enough of that on my own. I checked the group's camp the next morning because I needed to know what had happened, and found 3 bodies torn apart by infected, equipment scattered, supplies mostly destroyed. 5 survivors had escaped apparently because there were only 3 corpses and the group had been 8 strong when I'd observed them. I felt this cold certainty in my stomach that I'd see them again, that somehow this wasn't over, but I pushed it down and focused on the practical matter of salvaging what I could from the wreckage before scavengers or infected came back to finish picking through the remains. I was loading usable supplies into my pack when I heard a kid's voice behind me. "Please help us." I spun around with my rifle raised and found the youngest of the kids I'd seen yesterday. A boy, maybe 9 years old, covered in dirt and blood that might have been his or might have been someone else's, even with eyes that had already seen too much horror for someone his age. Behind him was one of the women, the one Derek had called Julie, and she had her arms around the boy in a protective gesture that told me everything I needed to know about their relationship. "We can't survive out here alone," Julie said, and her voice had this desperate edge that made it clear she was seconds away from complete breakdown. "My son Tommy is sick from the fog exposure. Derek and the others are hurt. We need help. Please." I should have said no. Should have walked away and let natural selection sort out who deserved to survive and who didn't, because that's how things worked in this new world, and sentiment was a luxury nobody could afford anymore. But I looked at Tommy's face. He saw genuine terror and suffering rather than the manipulative play acting I'd learned to recognize during my military service, and found myself making the second worst decision of my post-outbreak life. "One night," I said, lowering my rifle but keeping my hand near my sidearm because trust only went so far in the apocalypse. "I've got a shelter about a mile from here. You can recover there. I'll give you some supplies and basic survival instruction, but then you're on your own. One night. That's it." Julie started crying from relief, and Tommy just stared at me like I was some kind of miracle rather than an idiot making a tactical error that would probably get me killed, and I led them through the fog toward a cabin I'd identified as a safe decoy location specifically for situations like this. and I wasn't stupid enough to take unknown survivors back to the hollow where they'd learn the location of my primary shelter. They could camp at the cabin for one night. I'd provide basic assistance, and then they could continue east toward whatever delusion of safety they thought existed beyond the fog zone. The cabin was about a mile from the hollow, small and defensible with good sight lines, and I got Julie and Tommy settled while checking the boy for signs of serious fog exposure. His lungs sounded clear, which was good, but he had early-stage chemical burns on his exposed skin, which was bad, and I treated them with ointment from my medical kit while explaining what they needed to do to protect themselves from further damage. Derek and the two remaining women showed up an hour later, and I immediately regretted my decision to help, because the look Derek gave me when he saw my gear and my healthy appearance was pure calculation rather than gratitude. He knew I had resources, knew I was better equipped and better fed than his group. And I could see him trying to figure out angles and opportunities like this was a business negotiation rather than basic human charity during the literal end of the world. "You're the guy from yesterday," Derek said, not asking but stating it as fact. "Watching us. Where's your camp?" "I move around," I lied, keeping my body language loose but ready because I'd known enough men like Derek to recognize when violence was being considered as a problem-solving strategy. "Don't stay in one place long. Safer that way." "Bullshit," Derek said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You've got a base somewhere, good supplies, maybe room for more people if we can come to an arrangement." "One night," I repeated, making it clear this wasn't negotiable. "Tomorrow morning you head east, away from the heavy fog zones, look for other survivor groups or government safe zones that might still be operating. I'll give you enough food for 3 days and some basic protective gear, but then we're done and you don't try to follow me when I leave." Derek looked like he wanted to argue, but Julie cut him off before he could start. "Thank you," she said, putting emphasis on the words that Derek should have been saying. "This is more than we deserved after last night. We're grateful." I stayed at the cabin that evening because leaving immediately would have been suspicious, and I spent the time teaching Julie and the women some basic fog survival techniques while Derek sat apart from the group sharpening his hunting knife with this casual menace that was probably meant to intimidate me. Tommy followed me around asking questions about wilderness survival with the kind of desperate attention that kids get when they're trying to understand a world that stopped making sense. And I found myself answering more thoroughly than I'd planned because apparently I wasn't completely dead inside yet, even though I probably should have been. Night fell and the group settled into sleep, but I noticed Derek whispering to one of the women, Linda, I think her name was, and making gestures that suggested planning rather than idle conversation. And Guardian had followed me to the cabin and was coiled in the rafters watching everything. And when Derek and Linda's whispered conversation lasted longer than casual chat, I felt Guardian's warning hiss in the darkness even though no one else could hear it. I pretended to sleep but kept one hand on my pistol, and sure enough around 2 a.m. I heard movement outside the cabin, multiple footsteps trying to be quiet and failing because most people have no idea how loud they actually are when they're trying to move with stealth. I slipped out the back window before anyone could block it, circled around through the fog where my immunity gave me advantage, and watched from concealment as Derek and his remaining group members searched the cabin looking for me. "Where the hell did he go?" Derek hissed to Linda, frustration evident in his voice. "Maybe he heard us and ran," Linda suggested. "Or maybe he's smarter than we thought," Derek said, and I could hear the anger beneath his words. "Fine, we take his supplies, all of them. He wants to play ghost in the fog, let him do it without gear." They cleaned out everything I'd brought to the cabin. My spare rifle, the medical supplies, 3 days' worth of food I'd promised to give them anyway. And then Derek made a decision that confirmed every negative instinct I'd had about him since first seeing his group. "Leave him tied up outside," Derek ordered his people. Fog will take him in a day, maybe less. We take his gear and move on. No witnesses, no guilt. Except they couldn't tie me up because I wasn't there. Even while they were busy arguing about where I'd gone and whether they should search the surrounding forest, I'd already circled back to the hollow, collected Guardian and started making plans for what came next, because apparently my good deed for the apocalypse had just turned into a situation where I'd either need to eliminate a threat or learn to live with the fact that there were people out there who knew I existed and might come looking for my resources. Guardian and I made it back to the hollow well before dawn, and I spent the next few hours fortifying the entrance and setting up early warning systems in case Derek's group tried to track me. I'd been careful not to leave any obvious trails back from the cabin, had moved through areas where the fog would erase most traces of my passage. But Derek had shown himself to be smarter than I'd initially thought, and desperation made people resourceful in ways that could surprise you. Morning came gray and cold, and I sat in the hollow entrance with my rifle and watched the forest while Guardian maintained its position in the rafters above. Both of us waiting to see if my attempt at being a decent human being was going to get us killed. The fog was particularly thick that day, reducing visibility to maybe 5 feet, which meant if Derek's group did come looking, they'd have to get dangerously close before I'd see them. But it also meant they'd be moving blind through terrain they didn't know, with a fog that would start burning their skin after a few hours of exposure. And I was calculating odds and scenarios when Guardian descended from its position and moved toward the entrance with clear purpose, and I'd learned to trust the snake's instincts enough that I immediately readied my weapon and prepared for contact. Sure enough, maybe 2 minutes later, I heard voices approaching through the fog. Derek's voice carrying through the murk with that particular edge that meant he was angry and trying to hide it. "Has to be around here somewhere," Derek was saying to someone, probably Linda. "Tracks lead this direction even if they're hard to follow. He's got to have a shelter, and when we find it, we take it. Simple as that." "Derek, maybe we should just go," Linda's voice responded, sounding uncertain and tired. "Leave the area. Find somewhere else. He gave us food and you want to rob him? That's not right." "Right doesn't matter anymore," Derek shot back. "Survival matters. He has more than he needs. We have kids to feed. The math is simple. We take what we need to survive." I could have let them pass. Could have stayed hidden in the hollow and waited for them to give up and move on. But something in Derek's voice told me he was the kind of person who'd keep coming back. Keep looking, keep being a problem until someone made him stop. I'd served with guys like Derek in the army, seen what happened when you let bullies and strong men consolidate power in small groups, and I knew that letting him walk away now just meant dealing with a worse version of him later. So I made a decision that probably says terrible things about who I've become in this apocalypse. "Guardian," I said quietly. Even the snake's head turned toward me with focused attention. Can you go down there and bite them? The aggressive ones. Not Julie or Tommy, but the others." I know how it sounds. I'm talking to a snake, asking it to attack people on command, operating under the assumption that a reptile understands complex instructions about selective targeting. But Guardian had proven its intelligence a dozen times over the past month, had demonstrated understanding that went way beyond normal animal cognition. And when it looked at me in that moment, I swear I saw comprehension in those alien eyes. Guardian moved. I watched from the hollow entrance as 6 feet of timber rattlesnakes slithered into the fog with deadly purpose, and I heard Derek's group before I saw them, shouting, panic, the distinctive sound of a shotgun being fired badly. Guardian emerged from the fog maybe 3 minutes later with what looked like satisfaction in its posture, if snakes could feel satisfaction, and I knew the deed was done even before I heard Derek's screaming start. I gave it 10 minutes before approaching the scene, rifle ready in case Derek had enough fight left in him to be dangerous, and found exactly what I expected. Derek writhing on the ground with massive swelling in his leg where Guardian had struck. Linda and the other woman, Beth, both showing signs of envenomation in their hands and arms. And Julie and Tommy standing apart from the group, looking terrified but unharmed. Because Guardian had apparently understood my instruction about selective targeting. Julie had untied me. Wait, no, I wasn't tied up. And that was Derek's plan that failed when I wasn't where he expected. Julie ran to me looking panicked. "Please," she said, grabbing my arm. "Derek's dying. The others are hurt. You have to help them." "I don't," I said, surprised by how cold my own voice sounded. "I don't have antivenom. I don't have any way to save someone who's been bitten by a timber rattlesnake multiple times, and even if I did, Derek made his choice when he decided to rob me and leave me to die in the fog." Derek was conscious enough to hear this, and he looked at me with genuine fear mixing with his usual anger. You set that snake on us. You're a murderer." "No," I corrected him, walking closer so he could see my face clearly through the pain and venom-induced haze. "I'm a survivor, and you're a threat, was a threat. Ooh, past tense now." I raised my rifle and Derek's eyes went wide. "Wait!" I put a single round through his head, clean and quick, because whatever else I'd become, I wasn't going to let a man suffer through hours of envenomation death when a bullet could end it instantly. The sound echoed through the forest, and Linda and Beth both screamed, but the infected in the area had learned to avoid Guardian's territory over the past few weeks, so I wasn't worried about the noise attracting unwanted attention. "You killed him," Linda said, stating the obvious through shock and fear. "I did," I confirmed, then turned to face her and Beth. "You two helped him plan to rob me. Helped tie up supplies I'd given you out of basic human decency. Helped him decide to leave me to die in the fog. But you weren't the ones who pulled the trigger on that decision, Derek was. So here's what's going to happen. You take enough food for 3 days. You walk west away from here. You don't come back. If I see you again, I'll assume you're a threat and I'll respond accordingly. Understood?" Linda looked like she wanted to argue, but Beth grabbed her arm and pulled her away, and they grabbed their packs and disappeared into the fog without looking back. That left Julie and Tommy, and I wasn't sure what to do with them because they'd begged Derek not to attack me, according to what I'd overheard, had actively tried to prevent this situation even though they'd failed. "What about us?" Julie asked, and I could hear the terror in her voice, probably expecting me to shoot her and Tommy too, since I'd already crossed the line into killing people. And I looked at Tommy, 9 years old, scared, covered in fog burns that would get worse without treatment. And I thought about all the ways I could justify leaving them out here to fend for themselves. They'd slow me down. They'd consume resources. They'd be liabilities in any kind of dangerous situation. All of that was true, but Tommy hadn't done anything wrong except be born into a world that was ending. And Julie had tried to stop Derek's plan, even though she'd lacked the power to actually prevent it. "You stay until Tommy's healthy," I said, making a decision I'd probably regret but couldn't bring myself to avoid. "Then you decide, try to survive on your own or try to find other survivor groups. But you don't follow me. You don't try to find where I'm really staying. You respect that I'm helping you and don't make me regret it. And can you do that?" Julie nodded so fast I thought she might hurt her neck. "Yes, God, yes, thank you. We won't be any trouble, I promise." Guardian slithered back to me, and I could feel the weight of what I'd just done settling onto my shoulders like a physical thing. I'd killed a man. Not in combat, not in immediate self-defense, but as a calculated execution because he'd threatened me, and I'd decided his death was preferable to the ongoing risk of his existence. The Blake Carson who'd taught wilderness survival classes 6 weeks ago would have been horrified. The Blake Carson standing in the fog with a snake wrapped around his shoulders and Derek's body cooling nearby felt nothing except relief that a problem had been solved. Julie and Tommy followed me back to the hollow. I gave up on keeping its location secret since they already knew I had a shelter somewhere in this area, and trusting them seemed better than trying to maintain operational security I'd already compromised. Guardian took up its usual position in the rafters while Tommy stared at it with the kind of terrified awe that made sense when you realized this particular snake had just saved your life by killing people who would have gotten you killed through their leadership. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned that Julie had been a nurse before the outbreak, which made her immediately more valuable than I'd initially assessed because medical knowledge was worth its weight in gold when antibiotics were scarce and professional healthcare didn't exist anymore. She helped me organize my medical supplies more efficiently, taught me some techniques for treating common injuries that I'd never learned in my Army first aid training, and generally made herself useful enough that I started regretting the "you leave" when Tommy's healthy ultimatum I'd given because having someone with her skills around was a genuine asset. Tommy adapted to hollow life faster than I would have thought possible for a 9-year-old, learning to help with Guardian's care even though he was terrified of the snake at first, and I found myself teaching him wilderness survival skills the way I'd taught my students before the outbreak. Except this time the stakes were real and the lessons were literally life or death rather than expensive weekend entertainment for people who wanted to feel rugged. Guardian seemed to accept their presence, though it remained most comfortable around me, often coiling near my sleeping area at night or following me during scavenging runs while giving Julie and Tommy enough space that they didn't feel threatened. I caught Tommy feeding Guardian small pieces of meat one afternoon, moving with the kind of careful precision that showed he'd been paying attention to how I interacted with the snake, and Guardian accepted the food with gentle movements that suggested it understood this was a child and needed to be careful. "Why is it so smart?" Tommy asked me later, after Julie had gone to sleep and it was just him and me sitting in the dim light of my LED lantern. "Snakes aren't supposed to be smart like dogs or people, but Guardian is different." "The fog changed it," I said, and because that was my working theory even though I had no way to prove it. "Same way the fog changed the infected, made them faster, smarter, more dangerous. Guardian must have been exposed before I found it, and instead of dying, it adapted. Evolved, became something more than a normal snake." "Will it keep changing?" Tommy asked, and that was the question I'd been avoiding thinking about because I didn't know the answer. "Maybe," I admitted. "Or maybe this is as far as it goes. We'll find out together, I guess." Week 5 brought a new complication when Guardian started showing behavioral changes that went beyond its already unusual intelligence. It began positioning itself at the hollow entrance during specific times of day like it was standing guard, and it started hissing warnings minutes before infected appeared in the area, in giving us enough advance notice to prepare or hide that we were never caught by surprise. It also started hunting for the group rather than just itself, bringing back rabbits and once even a small deer that it had somehow managed to kill despite being a constrictor species that shouldn't be able to bring down prey that size. "It thinks we're its pack," Julie said one evening while we were watching Guardian arrange itself around the hollow in what I'd started to recognize as defensive positioning. "Or family, whatever social structure snakes have, it's decided we're part of it." "Snakes don't have social structures," I said, but even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't true anymore. Or at least they didn't before the fog. Now I don't know what the rules are. The fog was getting thicker with each passing week, and I was starting to wonder if it would ever dissipate, or if this was the new permanent state of the world, a corrosive mist that made being outside for extended periods dangerous to everyone except me and Guardian, and apparently the infected who seemed completely immune to its effects. Julie couldn't go out for more than an hour without protective gear, and Tommy even less since his smaller body couldn't handle the chemical exposure as well, which meant any scavenging or hunting that needed to be done in heavy fog areas fell to me. I was out on one of these solo runs about 3 miles from the hollow, when Guardian started acting strange, hissing repeatedly, refusing to move forward, positioning itself between me and the direction I'd been heading. I'd learned to trust the snake's instincts because they'd saved my life more times than I could count. So I backed away and found an elevated observation point to see what had Guardian spooked. There were dozens of them, maybe 50 infected, moving through the forest in a coordinated mass that suggested pack-hunting behavior, rather than the random wandering I'd observed in the early weeks of the outbreak. They were heading directly toward the hollow's general area, following some pattern or scent trail that I couldn't detect. And I realized with cold certainty that if they found the hollow, there was no way Julie and Tommy could defend themselves, even with the weapons I'd left them. I had to draw them off, redirect their attention towards something besides my shelter and the two vulnerable people sleeping inside it. But I had no idea how to do that without getting myself killed in the process, because 50 infected was more than I could fight even with Guardian's help and my fog immunity. I was trying to come up with a plan when I noticed something in the distance. Smoke rising from a location about 2 miles east of the hollow, which meant there was a fire, and fire meant either survivors being stupid or infected being drawn to a stimulus, and either way it might be the distraction I needed. I moved fast through the fog toward the smoke source, Guardian keeping pace beside me, and what I found was both better and worse than I'd expected. A small survivor group, maybe 6 people, who'd built a signal fire because apparently they thought advertising their location to every threat in a 10-mile radius was a smart survival strategy. And the infected horde had already detected the fire and were converging on the location with terrifying speed, and I watched from concealment as the survivors realized too late what was about to happen. I could help them, could warn them, could provide covering fire while they escaped, could use my immunity and Guardian's abilities to give them a fighting chance. But helping them meant exposing my location, meant risking Guardian's life and my own on people who'd been dumb enough to light a giant "please kill us" beacon in the middle of infected controlled forest. I made my choice and started to retreat toward the hollow, planning to use the time I'd gained by the infected being distracted to reinforce my defenses and prepare for the possibility they'd come our direction after finishing with the signal fire group. Guardian followed without question, and we were maybe 100 yards from the scene when I heard a kid screaming. Not an adult trying to sound like a kid, but an actual child's voice, high and terrified and calling for help that wasn't coming. Tommy was 9. This kid sounded younger, maybe 6 or 7. I stopped walking. "God damn it," I said to Guardian, who looked at me with what might have been concern or might have been my imagination projecting human emotions onto a snake again. "I'm going to regret this, aren't I?" Guardian didn't answer, but I ran back toward the signal fire anyway because apparently I hadn't completely lost my humanity yet, even though I'd tried really hard over the past month to bury it under layers of survival pragmatism and moral compromise. The infected hit the signal fire camp before I could reach it, and what I saw in the next 3 minutes was basically a masterclass in how not to survive the apocalypse. People running in random directions instead of grouping up, firing weapons wildly without aiming, panicking in ways that guaranteed they'd die even if they'd started with good defensive positions. The kid I'd heard screaming was maybe 7 years old, huddled behind an overturned table while infected tore through the camp's pathetic barricades like they weren't even there. And I had about 5 seconds to decide whether saving one terrified child was worth potentially dying myself. Guardian made the decision for me by launching itself into the infected mass and creating enough chaos that I could sprint in, grab the kid, and get back out before the infected recovered from their surprise at being attacked by a 6-foot rattlesnake that moved faster than any reptile had a right to. The kid screamed when I picked her up, but she was smart enough not to fight me, and I ran through the fog with Guardian following while infected gave chase for maybe 200 yards before losing our trail in the dense mist that I could navigate and they couldn't. I found a defensive position in some heavy rocks about a mile from the hollow. far enough that even if infected tracked us this far, they wouldn't lead them back to Julie and Tommy. And then I set the kid down while catching my breath and trying not to think about the fact that I'd just saved a complete stranger's child instead of letting nature take its course like every survival instinct in my body was screaming I should have done. "You're okay now," I told the girl who was maybe 6 or 7 with dark hair and eyes that were way too old for someone her age. "What's your name?" She didn't answer immediately, just stared at me with this blank expression that suggested trauma or shock or both, and I gave her space to process while Guardian coiled nearby, keeping watch. Eventually she said, "Emma," in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, and I realized this kid had probably watched everyone she knew get torn apart in the last 10 minutes and was doing a remarkable job of holding herself together considering. "Emma, I'm Blake," I said, keeping my voice calm and level in that way you do when you're trying not to spook someone who's already terrified. "That's Guardian," I nodded toward the snake. "We're going to keep you safe, but I need you to do exactly what I say when I say it. Can you do that?" Emma nodded, and I saw her eyes track to Guardian with fear but also curiosity, like she was smart enough to realize the snake had helped save her and deserved respect rather than just terror. We stayed in the rocks for about an hour, waiting to see if infected would track us, and when it became clear we'd lost them, I made a decision that I knew Julie would support but that I personally had mixed feelings about. I took Emma back to the hollow. Julie's reaction when we arrived was immediate maternal protection, in pulling Emma into a hug and checking her for injuries while Tommy watched with this expression that suggested he was glad to have someone closer to his age around, even though the circumstances of her arrival were horrific. I gave them space to bond while I talked with Guardian about the situation we now found ourselves in, which, yes, I realize sounds insane because I'm having strategic conversations with a snake. But we'd developed enough of a communication system over the past weeks that I could basically think out loud and Guardian would respond with body language that indicated agreement or disagreement. "So now we're 4, I said to Guardian while it coiled around my shoulders in its favorite position. 1 combat-trained adult with fog immunity, 1 nurse with medical skills, and 2 kids who can barely defend themselves. This is not an optimal survival unit." Guardian didn't argue with my assessment, which I took as agreement that our group composition was basically terrible from a tactical standpoint, but there wasn't much we could do about it at this point because I wasn't going to kick out a 6-year-old just to optimize our chances of survival. Over the next 2 weeks, Emma integrated into our little hollow community with the kind of resilient adaptability that kids somehow manage even when they probably should be completely traumatized and broken. She helped Tommy with the chickens. Wait, I didn't mention we had chickens, did I? I'd found 3 laying hens during a scavenging run and brought them back because eggs were protein we could rely on. And they'd adapted to hollow life surprisingly well, and she learned to be quiet during the periods when infected were active nearby, and she helped Julie with basic medical supply organization and generally made herself useful enough that I stopped second-guessing my decision to save her. Guardian seemed fascinated by Emma in particular, often positioning itself near her when she slept and being unusually gentle when she wanted to touch its scales, and I wondered if the snake had developed some kind of protective instinct toward children specifically, or if it just recognized Emma as the most vulnerable member of our group and adjusted its behavior accordingly. Either way, watching a massive venomous snake interact carefully with a 6-year-old girl was surreal in ways that I still hadn't fully processed, even though I'd been living this nightmare for 2 months now. Julie and I developed a routine that felt almost domestic if you ignored the whole end of civilization context, splitting tasks in ways that played to our respective strengths. I handled hunting and scavenging and anything that required going into the fog. She handled medical care and food preparation and keeping the kids from losing their minds from boredom and fear. We didn't talk much about our lives before the outbreak because what was the point, really? The world we'd known was gone, and dwelling on it just made the present harder to bear. But occasionally, late at night when both kids were asleep, she'd share little details about her nursing career or her dead husband who'd been killed in the first week of the outbreak. And I'd share pieces of my army service or my survival instruction business or the anonymous text that had saved my life. "Do you ever wonder who sent it?" Julie asked one night while we were on watch together. Guardian coiled between us, providing warmth in the cold autumn air. The warning. Someone went to a lot of trouble to hide their identity, but also to save you specifically. That suggests personal connection. I think about it constantly, I admitted, because the mystery of my anonymous benefactor had been nagging at me for weeks. Could have been someone from my army days. Could have been a former student who happened to have inside information. And could have been random chance and I'm reading too much into it. Or could have been someone who's still out there watching, Julie suggested, and I didn't like the implications of that thought but couldn't dismiss it either. Week 7 brought a massive infected migration through our area, and I spent 3 days watching from elevated positions as maybe 200 of them moved through the forest in organized groups that suggested hive behavior, or at least some kind of collective intelligence emerging from the fog exposure. They were getting smarter, developing tactics that went beyond simple chase and kill, and I documented several instances of tool use, infected picking up rocks or branches and using them as weapons rather than just relying on teeth and hands. Guardian was increasingly agitated during this period, hissing warnings constantly, and I realized the snake was picking up on something I couldn't sense, some danger that my human perception was missing. The danger revealed itself on day 8 when infected found the hollow. I don't know how they located us specifically. Could have been scent, could have been systematic search patterns, could have been pure bad luck. But I woke up to Guardian's panicked hissing and the sound of multiple infected clawing at the camouflaged entrance, trying to break through. Julie grabbed the kids and pulled them to the upper chamber while I positioned myself at the entrance with my rifle. And for 10 minutes it was pure chaos as I tried to hold a defensive position against infected that were learning to coordinate their attacks rather than just throwing themselves mindlessly at obstacles. Guardian descended from the upper chamber despite my yelling at it to stay with the kids, and it launched itself into the infected mass in a way that I knew meant it was protecting us even though the cost would be its own life. I watched my snake, my friend, because that's what Guardian had become over the past weeks, get torn apart by zombies while creating enough distraction that I could pick off the ones climbing the trunk with headshots. The carnage lasted maybe 5 more minutes before the infected either lost interest or ran out of targets. And when it was over, I counted 17 dead infected around the hollow entrance and Guardian's remains scattered among them. Just scales and bones and blood that proved my companion had existed and mattered and died, saving us. Tommy was crying when I climbed back to the upper chamber. And Emma was silent in that way that meant she was processing trauma she didn't have words for yet. And Julie looked at me with this expression that suggested she understood what Guardian's death meant to me, even though I was trying to keep my face neutral and professional because crying about a snake seemed ridiculous when we'd just survived a major attack. "It knew," Tommy said through his tears. "Guardian knew they'd kill it, but it did it anyway to save us." "Yeah," I managed to say, voice rougher than I'd intended. "That's what family does." We spent the next 3 days in complete lockdown mode while I figured out if the attack had been an isolated incident or the start of a pattern, and when it became clear that the infected had moved on, I went down to collect Guardian's remains and build a cairn of stones over what was left. Julie and the kids helped, each of us placing rocks in silence. And I found myself saying a few words even though I'd never been particularly religious and didn't know what kind of eulogy was appropriate for a rattlesnake that had become more human than most humans in its loyalty and sacrifice. The weeks that followed were harder emotionally than the physical challenges of survival because I'd lost my primary advantage. Guardian's early warning system and reconnaissance abilities had kept us safe in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until they were gone. And now every sound in the forest might be a threat, and every shadow might be infected, and I was back to operating on human senses alone, which felt inadequate and vulnerable. Julie started spending more time with me during watch rotations, I not saying much, but being present in ways that suggested she understood grief wasn't something you processed alone. And gradually I found myself opening up about what Guardian had meant to me beyond its tactical utility. Having a non-human companion had kept me sane during the isolation of early survival, had given me something to care about besides my own continued existence, and losing that had created a hole I didn't know how to fill. Week 10 brought voices in the fog again, except this time they were different from Derek's group. Organized, disciplined, moving with military precision that suggested training rather than desperate survival. I scouted carefully and found a group of maybe 30 people, all adults, led by a woman in her 50s who carried herself with the kind of authority that comes from actual leadership experience rather than bullying your way to the top. I watched them for 2 days before making contact, observing their camp setup and interaction patterns and decision-making processes, and what I saw was both impressive and concerning. They had resources, organization, defensive positions that actually made tactical sense, but they also had this authoritarian structure where the leader's word was absolute, and dissent wasn't tolerated in ways that reminded me of military dictatorships I'd seen during my deployment years. The leader noticed me observing on day 3, which told me she was competent enough to spot surveillance despite my best efforts at concealment, and she called out to me directly, You can come in or stay hidden, but if you choose to stay hidden, I'm going to assume you're hostile and respond accordingly." I made myself visible, rifle slung but accessible, and approached their perimeter with enough caution that they'd know I wasn't stupid, but enough confidence that they wouldn't think I was desperate. The woman who'd spotted me was maybe 55, fit despite her age, with gray hair and eyes that had seen enough shit that not much surprised her anymore. "Dr. Elaine Porter," she introduced herself, offering a hand that I shook after a moment's hesitation. "Former CDC bioweapons researcher, current leader of this particular survivor group, and the person who sent you that text 2 months ago telling you to leave the cities." That stopped me cold. Because I'd had theories about my anonymous benefactor, but CDC bioweapons researcher hadn't been on my list of possibilities. How did I have your number? How did I know to warn you specifically?" Elaine smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "I had access to outbreak data 2 weeks before it went public, and I sent warnings to 52 people I judged most likely to survive if they had advance notice. Former military, survival instructors, people with skills and mindsets that suggested they wouldn't waste the opportunity. You're the 7th I've found alive." "What happened to the other 45? I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Dead, probably," Elaine said with clinical detachment. "Or worse. The fog enhances infected, but it also accelerates their decay. Long-term, they'll break down. But short-term, they're faster and smarter than living humans, and that's a problem we're still working on solving." She offered to show me their camp, explain their operation, pitch me on joining their group, and I followed her while keeping track of exits and defensive positions because people who'd survived this long with this many resources weren't altruists. They had angles and agendas, and I needed to understand theirs before committing to anything. What I saw was both impressive and disturbing. They'd established a genuine safe zone with walls, guard rotations, organized food production, but they'd also clearly built it using forced labor from people who didn't have the skills to say no. And their security protocols looked a lot like prison camp enforcement. "Chun, we need immune individuals," Elaine explained as we toured the facilities. Your snakebite immunity is exactly the kind of resource that could save this entire community if we can study it, replicate it, develop a treatment protocol. You want my blood? I said flatly. I want to save the human race, Elaine corrected. And yes, that requires some sacrifice from individuals who happen to have valuable biological advantages. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. That's not tyranny, that's mathematics. I thought about Julie and Tommy and Emma back at the Hollow, thought about what joining this group would mean for them. And I realized that everything Elaine was saying made logical sense, and also made my skin crawl because I'd seen enough of greater good justifications to know that the phrase usually preceded something horrible being done to people who couldn't defend themselves. I need to think about it, I told Elaine, which was polite speak for I'm leaving now and probably never coming back. She gave me coordinates and a 3-day deadline to decide, and I hiked back to the Hollow with a lot on my mind about safety versus freedom, and whether surviving as a prisoner was better than dying free. Julie listened to my description of Elaine's group and had immediate strong opinions. It's a work camp, she said bluntly. They'll take your blood, study you like a lab rat. And when they're done extracting value from you, they'll move on to extracting value from me and the kids. That's not safety, Blake. That's slavery with extra steps. But it is safe, I countered, playing devil's advocate even though I agreed with her. Walls, guards, medical facilities, real protection. Tommy and Emma could have childhoods instead of just survival. You could practice nursing instead of desperately treating infections with scavenged antibiotics. At what cost? Julie asked. Our freedom? Our autonomy? Our right to make decisions about our own lives? Tommy was listening from the corner where he was supposed to be sleeping, and he spoke up in that way kids do when adults forget they're in the room. I don't want to go there, he said quietly. It sounds scary, like they'd make us do things we don't want to do. I'd rather stay here with you and Julie and Emma and be free even if it's hard. Emma nodded agreement, and I realized that even traumatized kids understood the difference between protective custody and imprisonment. And if they preferred the Hollow's harsh freedom to Elaine's comfortable cage, then maybe their instincts were better than my tactical analysis. We don't go, I decided. We stay here, we stay free, and we survive on our own terms. Julie smiled with genuine relief, and I felt the weight of the decision settle over me because I'd just chosen principle over pragmatism in a world where pragmatism was usually what kept you alive. But some things mattered more than survival, and this was apparently one of them. I didn't go back to Elaine's compound within the 3 days she'd given me, but she came to me on day 4 with 3 armed guards and a proposition that turned out to be an ultimatum. You're too valuable to leave wandering in the wilderness, she explained while her guards positioned themselves between me and the Hollow entrance. We need your immunity, we need your blood, and we're willing to take you by force if you won't come voluntarily. I had my rifle, but 4 against 1 with kids behind me wasn't odds I could win, and Elaine knew it, which is why she'd brought backup. I could have fought, could have gotten myself killed trying to protect my freedom, but then Julie and the kids would be undefended and Elaine would probably take them too just to ensure compliance. If I come, Julie and the kids stay free, I said, negotiating from a position of weakness but trying to salvage something from the situation. And they don't get conscripted. They don't get forced into your labor system. They get to leave if they want. Done, Elaine agreed immediately, which suggested she'd been willing to offer that concession all along and had just waited to see if I'd ask for it. But you come now and you don't try anything stupid during the trip back to the compound. I kissed Julie on the forehead, hugged both kids, and told them I'd find a way back eventually, even though I had no idea if that was true. Julie was crying, Tommy was trying not to cry, and Emma was silent in that way that meant she was processing another trauma to add to her collection. Stay in the Hollow, I told them. Use the supplies I cached, be careful, Survive. Come back, Julie said. Julie, in which was what Linda had told me months ago before I'd left on a scavenging run that had turned into Derek's ambush. And I wondered if I was making a pattern of leaving people behind and whether that said something meaningful about my character, or was just the reality of survival in this new world. Elaine's compound was exactly as dystopian as I'd feared, with work assignments based on contribution value and punishment details for anyone who questioned the system in this pervasive atmosphere of fear underneath the veneer of order and safety. I was immediately assigned to the medical research division, which meant spending my days having blood drawn and tissue samples taken while doctors who'd probably been perfectly ethical people before the outbreak justified increasingly invasive procedures with appeals to the greater good and the needs of the species. Julie and Tommy appeared at the compound 2 weeks after my capture, and my heart sank when I saw them because I'd told them to stay away. But Julie explained that infected had overrun the hollow area, and they'd had no choice except to seek protection at the only safe zone within 50 miles. Emma was with them, which meant all 3 of the people I'd tried to protect by surrendering myself had ended up in exactly the situation I'd been trying to prevent. "I'm sorry," Julie said when we had a moment alone together, her hand on my arm and tears in her eyes. "We tried to stay away. You tried to honor what you wanted. But the infected were everywhere, and we couldn't survive out there without you." "It's not your fault," I told her, and meant it because blaming her for circumstances beyond her control would be cruel and pointless. "We'll figure something out, find a way to get you out of here." Except getting out turned out to be significantly harder than I'd thought, because Elaine's security was designed specifically to prevent escapes, and they'd gotten very good at catching people who tried to leave without permission. I watched 3 people get executed over my first month there for attempting to undermine the community's security, which was Elaine's euphemism for trying to run away, and I realized that we were well past the point where moral appeals or rational arguments would sway her, because she'd committed so fully to her utilitarian calculus that individual deaths had become acceptable if they served the larger goal of species survival. 2 months into my imprisonment, I made a decision that I knew was probably suicidal but felt necessary anyway. I was going to escape, taking Tommy with me regardless of what it cost. Julie wanted to come too, wanted to bring Emma. But I knew that 4 people trying to move through the forest together was a recipe for getting caught or killed, and I needed her to stay behind as cover so Elaine wouldn't immediately realize I was gone. "I can't just let you take my son," Julie protested when I explained the plan, even though her voice lacked conviction because she knew Tommy wasn't safe here and might never be safe as long as Elaine saw him as leverage to keep his mother compliant. "He's not safe here," I said, making explicit what we both already knew. "Elaine will use him, will experiment on him if she thinks his biology might provide useful data. We'll sacrifice him if the math suggests it's worth it. At least with me he has a chance." "And Emma?" Julie asked. "I can't save everyone," I admitted, hating myself for the pragmatism but knowing it was true. "Tommy comes with me because he's your son and you're my friend and I owe you. Emma stays because taking her increases our chance of getting caught, and getting caught means all of this was for nothing." Julie cried, but she agreed. And then we spent the next week carefully preparing for an escape attempt that would probably fail, but felt necessary anyway because some things are worth dying for, and freedom was apparently on that list. I stole a guard uniform, created a fake patrol schedule that would give us maybe 2 hours before anyone noticed we were gone, and prepared supplies that we'd need to survive the initial sprint through infected heavy forest until we could reach somewhere defensible. The night we escaped was foggy and cold, which was perfect because it meant visibility was shit and patrols would be more focused on staying warm than maintaining perfect perimeter security. Tommy followed my instructions perfectly, moving when I moved and staying silent when I signaled quiet. And we made it over the fence using grappling gear I'd improvised from supplies in the medical facility. Guards spotted us about 50 yards from the perimeter and opened fire, but the fog obscured their aim, and we disappeared into the gray murk before they could organize a proper pursuit. Elaine's voice echoed after us through the darkness, calling Tommy's name and telling us we'd just killed him by taking him into the wilderness. But I blocked it out and focused on putting distance between us and the compound, because if we could get far enough fast enough, they might decide we weren't worth pursuing. We made it back to the hollow territory 3 days later, exhausted and half-starved, but alive. And I'd never been more grateful to see that giant cedar tree than I was when we finally stumbled into the clearing where it stood. And the hollow was still standing, still defensible, and I'd cached enough supplies in the surrounding forest that we could survive here for months if we were careful. Tommy collapsed immediately upon reaching safety, and I checked him for injuries while trying to process that we'd actually escaped, and I hadn't gotten him killed through my reckless planning. He had chemical burns from fog exposure during our run, had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, and looked about 5 years older than when I'd left him with Julie 2 months ago, but he was alive and free, and that was what mattered. "Did we make it?" Tommy asked through exhaustion. "Are we really safe?" "Safe is a relative term," I told him honestly, because lying to kids about the danger they're in doesn't help them survive it. "But we're free and we're together, and that's the best I can offer right now." We settled into a new routine over the following weeks, just Tommy and me surviving in the hollow without Julie's medical expertise or Emma's company or guardian's protection, and it was harder than before because we were understaffed and overworked and constantly on edge about Elaine's people tracking us down. But we made it work through careful resource management and strategic scavenging, and Tommy proving himself significantly more capable than I'd given him credit for, because apparently 3 months of apocalypse survival had turned a 9-year-old into someone who could set snares and start fires and defend himself when necessary. I thought about Julie constantly, wondered if she was okay, if Emma had survived, either if Elaine was punishing them for my escape or if she'd accepted it as an inevitable cost of trying to control people who weren't willing to be controlled. I wanted to go back for them, wanted to burn the whole compound down and free everyone Elaine had imprisoned in the name of species survival. But wanting things doesn't make them possible. And sometimes the best you can do is survive and hope that's enough. Tommy killed his first infected during our 2nd week back at the hollow, a clean headshot with the rifle I'd been teaching him to use, and I watched him process what he'd done with the kind of practical acceptance that suggested he'd crossed some fundamental line from childhood into whatever you call the thing that comes after when the world is ending and you have to become hard to survive. "Ian, does it get easier?" he asked me that evening while we were eating rabbit that he'd snared himself. "Killing them?" "No," I told him truthfully, because lying about the cost of violence doesn't help anyone. "It gets necessary, but it doesn't get easier." Months passed, then years. Tommy grew from a 9-year-old kid into a young teenager who could navigate the fog better than most adults I'd known before the outbreak, who could track infected by their movement patterns and avoid them when fighting wasn't worth it, who'd learned wilderness survival not as academic exercise but as literal life or death necessity. I got older and more scarred and more isolated, and sometimes I'd visit Guardian's cairn and wonder if the snake had known it would die protecting us or if it had just been following instinct programmed by the fog's influence on its biology. I chose to believe Guardian had understood, had made a conscious choice to sacrifice itself for the pack it considered family, because believing that meant something in the world still operated on principles beyond pure survival and resource competition. We never saw Elaine's people again, which suggested either they'd written us off as acceptable losses, or they'd collapsed into the same chaos that had consumed every other attempt at organized society we'd heard about through our scavenged radio equipment. Julie and Emma remained ghosts in my thoughts. People I'd failed to save or had chosen not to save, depending on how charitably I wanted to interpret my own decisions. And I carried that guilt the way I carried the memory of Derek's execution and all the other moral compromises the apocalypse had required. 3 years after the outbreak, with Tommy now 12 and me feeling like I'd aged 30 years instead of 3, we made contact with another survivor group through radio signals they'd been broadcasting from somewhere north of our position. They claimed to have stability, resources, a functional community that didn't require forced labor or authoritarian control, and part of me wanted to believe them while another part remembered that Elaine had claimed similar things before revealing her compound's true nature. "Do we go check it out?" Tommy asked. And because at this point we made decisions together rather than me just dictating his life. And I appreciated that he trusted me enough to ask rather than just assuming I'd know the right answer. "I don't know," I admitted. "Going means risk. Staying means isolation. Both options have costs. But staying also means freedom," Tommy pointed out, echoing the conversation I'd had with Julie years ago when we'd chosen the Hollow over Elaine's compound. "And we've made freedom work this far." He was right, and we decided to stay, to keep surviving in our Hollow fortress where we controlled our own lives, even if those lives were harder and lonelier than they would be in a larger community. Some people are built for civilization, need social structures and hierarchy and rules to feel secure. Some people are built for wilderness, who need freedom and autonomy and space even when it comes with danger. Tommy and I were apparently in the second category. 5 years after the outbreak, with the infected population declining as the fog finally started thinning and environmental pressures wore down their numbers, we began cautiously expanding our territory and making contact with other isolated survivors who'd chosen similar paths. None of them were Julie or Emma, which meant they were either dead or had made their own compromises with authority in exchange for safety. But they were living humans who'd maintained their independence, and that counted for something. I taught wilderness survival skills again, except this time to people who actually needed them instead of weekend warriors looking for entertainment. Anne and Tommy helped me train younger survivors in tactics and fog navigation and all the hard-won knowledge we'd accumulated through years of desperate learning. Guardian's sacrifice had created a legacy of survival that extended beyond just the two of us. And I like to think the snake would have approved of that if it had possessed enough intelligence to understand legacy and legacy's importance. The world was never going to go back to what it had been before, and anyone who thought otherwise was delusional or selling something. The fog had changed things permanently, had rewritten rules about what was possible and what humans could survive, and we were all living in its aftermath whether we liked it or not. But we were living, and for people like Tommy and me who'd chosen freedom over security and isolation over compromise, living was enough. I'm telling you this story now because you might be in a similar position, might be deciding between the safe path and the free path, between joining some authorities' promised community or striking out on your own with whatever skills and resources you can scrape together. I can't tell you which choice is right because everyone's circumstances are different and everyone's risk tolerance varies, but I can tell you what I learned during 5 years of surviving the Hollow. Safety is an illusion. Every compound falls eventually, every authority becomes tyrannical eventually, every promise of security gets broken eventually. Freedom is a fight. Every day, every hour, every decision you make about who you are and what you're willing to tolerate. Choose which one matters more to you and live with what that choice costs. And because both paths cost something. Elaine's path cost freedom and autonomy and the right to make choices about your own body. My path cost companionship and ease and the comfort of walls and guards. Julie's path, wherever she ended up, Cost her relationship with her son and probably cost her pieces of her soul as she compromised with systems she fundamentally disagreed with. There are no good options in the apocalypse. There are only different kinds of bad, and you get to pick which flavor of bad you can live with. Tommy's here next to me right now, 15 years old and built like someone who's spent years doing hard physical labor in dangerous conditions, and he wants to say something. Blake taught me how to survive, but more than that, he taught me why surviving matters, not just staying alive, but staying you, staying free. By staying human when the world wants to make you into something else. If you're listening to this and trying to decide what to do, remember that. Survival isn't just about eating and breathing and not dying. It's about choosing who you are when everything's trying to make that choice for you. Smart kid. Guardian would have liked him. This is Blake Carson, somewhere in Olympic National Forest, 5 years after the world ended, and I'm still here. Guardian's gone. Julie's gone. Emma's gone. But Tommy's here, and we've built something that matters, and that's enough for today. If you're surviving, keep going. If you're fighting, keep swinging. And if you're listening to this trying to figure out what comes next, trust your gut. It's the only thing that won't lie to you when everyone else is selling false hope or demanding false sacrifice. To stay free out there, stay you, stay alive, Blake out. A note from the author. Look, I need to be completely honest with you for a minute because I've spent the last several hours writing this story and it's left me feeling things I wasn't expecting when I started. Creating Blake and Guardian's relationship was harder than I thought it would be. There's something about writing a bond between a human and an animal, especially an animal that shouldn't be capable of that kind of connection. That hits different than writing human relationships. Guardian's death hurt to write, like genuinely made me uncomfortable as I was typing it out, because I'd created this character that was never supposed to be a character in the traditional sense, and then had to kill it in a way that demonstrated sacrifice and intelligence and loyalty. And that's the thing about post-apocalyptic survival stories that always gets me. They force us to confront what happens to humanity when all the structures we rely on collapse. Blake isn't a hero. He kills Derek in cold blood. He leaves people to die. He makes pragmatic choices that are morally questionable at best. But he also saves Emma when he could have left her. He teaches Tommy survival skills instead of just using him as labor. He chooses freedom over safety even when that choice makes survival harder. I made a deliberate decision not to make this a story about finding a cure or rebuilding civilization or any of those hopeful narrative arcs that post-apocalyptic fiction often defaults to because, honestly, I think those narratives can be dishonest. Sometimes the world just ends and there's no fixing it, and then the question becomes who you are in that ending. What you're willing to sacrifice and what you're willing to preserve. The fog was inspired by real atmospheric contamination that can happen when industrial systems collapse. I spent too much time researching chemical burns and corrosive environmental damage to make those details accurate. And if you're wondering whether fog with pH 2 would really eat through metal that fast, yes, it would. It's horrifying. Guardian was the hardest character to write because I had to convey intelligence and personality without dialogue or internal monologue, and I'm still not sure I pulled it off convincingly. Did the snake really understand Blake's instructions? Did it genuinely sacrifice itself, or was that just fortunate instinct? I deliberately left that ambiguous because I think the ambiguity is more interesting than a definitive answer. But I'd love to hear what you think. Did Guardian feel real to you? Or did it feel like I was just projecting human emotions onto a reptile because the story needed it to be more than just a snake? Julie and Tommy's storyline ending the way it did was necessary but painful, because I wanted to show that survival often means loss. And sometimes the people you try to save don't get saved, and you have to live with that. Julie made her choice to prioritize safety for Emma over freedom, and that's not wrong. It's just different from Blake's choice, and both paths have costs that the other path doesn't have. Elaine as an antagonist represents something I find genuinely frightening, which is well-intentioned authoritarianism. And she's not evil for evil's sake. She genuinely believes she's saving humanity through her methods. And that makes her more dangerous than someone like Derek, who was just a bully. Greater good justifications terrify me because historically they've been used to justify some truly horrible things. And I wanted to explore what that looks like in an apocalyptic context. Here's what I'm genuinely curious about, and I want to hear from you in the comments. If you were in Blake's position, would you have joined Elaine's compound? Would you trade freedom for safety if safety meant walls and food and medical care for the kids you were protecting? Because I honestly don't know what I'd do in that situation. And I suspect a lot of people who think they'd choose freedom would actually choose safety when they're exhausted and scared and responsible for children. And the bigger question, was Blake right to take Tommy and leave Julie and Emma? Was that rescue or kidnapping? Was it respecting individual freedom or imposing his values on a child who couldn't make informed consent? I deliberately didn't answer that in the story because I think it's complicated. And the right answer probably depends on your own philosophy about freedom versus safety. The hollow tree is based on real trees in Olympic National Forest. There are ancient cedars with fire-hollowed interiors that are exactly like I described. And they're amazing and haunting and feel almost sacred when you stand inside them. Yet if you ever get a chance to visit old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest, do it. Because those trees are survivors of a different kind and they deserve respect. I wrote the ending to be ambiguous about whether humanity recovers or just limps along in isolated pockets because honestly I think both are possible, and which one happens depends on choices people make that we can't predict. Blake and Tommy's version of survival isn't the only valid one, and I hope that came through. Some people will rebuild civilization, some people will choose isolation, and both paths require courage, even if they require different kinds of courage. One thing I'm proud of in this story is that I didn't make any of the female characters helpless victims or romantic interests for Blake. Julie's a competent nurse making rational decisions about safety versus freedom. Emma's a traumatized kid who adapts instead of just crying. And Elaine's a genuinely threatening antagonist with coherent philosophy behind her actions. I'm tired of apocalyptic fiction where women exist primarily to be rescued or to provide emotional support for male protagonists. And I tried to avoid that here, though you'll tell me if I failed. The lack of a traditional romance plot was deliberate. Not every story needs to be about finding love in the ruins, and honestly, I think the Blake/Guardian relationship was more emotionally complex and interesting than a romance would have been. And sometimes the most meaningful connection you have is with something that can't reciprocate with words but shows up when you need it anyway. So here's what I want from you if you made it this far. Tell me in the comments what you would have done differently. Would you have saved Derek's group or left them to die? Would you have joined Elaine's compound? Would you have taken Tommy or left him with Julie? What does freedom mean to you when staying free might mean dying alone? And if you appreciated this story, if Blake and Guardian and Tommy felt real to you for a few hours, hit that like button and consider subscribing, because your support literally makes it possible for me to keep writing these long-form narratives instead of doing something more practical with my time. Thanks for reading. Seriously, it means everything. And now go think about what kind of person you'd be when the world ends, and maybe do some prep work just in case my paranoid survival instructor protagonist was onto something about being ready for the worst. Until next time, stay free, stay you, and maybe consider what you'd do if you got a text from a number that didn't exist telling you to leave the cities. The end.